So democracy is being fueled by a teeny tiny fraction of the country. But there is a very real debate going on right now about whether the infamous Citizens United decision is even the problem here, whether or not this is something new or something that was always true in the law. That debate came to Capitol Hill today when Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig and Cato Institute senior fellow Ilya Shapiro appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights to talk about super PACs. Now, this is something that actually kind of bugs me in Washington. All day long on Capitol Hill, brilliant people are testifying before congressional committees on the key issues of the day. And there's really no good way for ordinary citizens who don't happen to be watching C-SPAN at that exact right moment to hear what they have said. So tonight we've asked Professors Lessig and Soman to join us and help get to the bottom of these shockingly tiny numbers. So joining us now, Lawrence Lessig, Harvard Law professor and author of what I think is the best book on campaign finance reform, Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. And Ilya Shapiro, senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute, editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Thank you both very much for being here.
Good to be here.
So let me begin with you here. You argue that even if you're much more concerned about the amount of money being spent by super PACs and other entities than I think you are, that Citizens United is not the villain you should be looking at. It is not the right court case to be focusing your attention on. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. All Citizens United did was let corporations, unions, any group of people spend money on independent political speech, not donate to parties or candidates or campaigns, but independently speak politically. And you know who's taking advantage of that? Unions, advocacy groups, not big corporations. Corporations are staying out because they don't want to piss off half of their consumers.
And Professor Lessig, first, is that right? And second, if it is right, how did we get to this point where such a small fraction of the population is accountable for such a large amount of the actual money funding our elections?
Well, it is right that the most significant growth is coming from individuals who are participating. But it's not right to say that that's not tied to Citizens United. Citizens United started a cascade of decisions in the lower courts and then in the FEC to change the basic structure of what's now called the super PAC. The super PAC has become this super weapon for gathering large contributions and deploying them in political context. And whenever you can get large contributions and don't have to go after smaller contributions, what campaign managers recognize is that it's more efficient to go after the bigger contributions. And what that means is an ever-shrinking percentage of Americans who are going to be responsible for funding campaigns, and that the gap between the people and the funders only grows even greater.
So this is actually an interesting issue, I think, in that what we're really talking about on a day-to-day basis here is the constitutional architecture of how we fund elections. So, Professor Lessig, one of the arguments you make is that it is clear in the Constitution and in the history around the Constitution that the framers intended the politicians, our legislators, to be dependent on the people, not to be dependent on this other class of folks called funders. And so the current situation is clearly unconstitutional, or at least clearly at odds with framers' intent. And Ilya, I was curious to hear your reaction to that, whether you think that this is not the situation we should be in, or whether or not there's a broader interpretation of those words we should be taking.
No, the problem is you have this ungainly system where, because of a 1976 Supreme Court case, not Citizens United, it's called Buckley versus Vallejo, Congress is allowed to cap contributions to candidates, but not candidates' spending. And so it's an unbalanced system, when that's what forces campaigns to fundraise all the time, and that's why we have this free speech on the independent side, but candidates and campaigns are hampered, and so there's this instability in the system that creates all sort of perverse incentives.
And so right now, I think that's a huge point, right? Because we talk all the time about Citizens United. We don't tend to talk that much about Buckley v. Vallejo, although that really was, I think, the fundamental architecture of what we can and can't do in campaign finance reform. The big idea that's floating around Congress right now is a Disclose Act, which wouldn't put limits on the amount of money that anybody could spend in elections, but would force a much more aggressive form of transparency and disclosure. And Professor Lessig, you made an argument today that I hadn't heard before and I thought was really persuasive, which is that within that context, disclose wouldn't work because some of what we're worried about here isn't just money that gets spent, but money that people threaten to spend. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, this is both an argument that's being made in the academic literature. Shulman and Kaplan have a nice paper called The Iceberg Theory of Campaign Contributions that points out that the contribution is actually hiding a much larger threatened contribution to the other side to have its effect. But actually, Evan Bayh made the point very compellingly in a
Former
panel,
senator from
former
Indiana.
senator, where he said, look, what everybody's worried about in Washington right now, all the incumbents, is that 30 days before an election, some super PAC is going to come in and drop $1 million on the other side. So what do you do to protect yourself? Well, you need to buy some super PAC insurance. And how do you buy super PAC insurance? Basically the assurance that if somebody drops a bomb against you, you'll have somebody on your side willing to drop an equal or larger bomb to support you. You have to pay your premium in advance. And how do you pay your super PAC premium in advance? You begin to behave today in a way that will encourage or cement the support you need from the super PAC on your side to back you up when it comes time for you to be supported because the attack has come from the other side. So this is the economics of a protection racket, right? And the point is, all of the effect is happening long before anybody spends $1, and perfect disclosure of that effect, perfect disclosure could never even begin to capture that effect because, of course, you could never disclose a threat.
And so, Ilya, do you worry about this? Because you're right that corporations haven't radically increased their spending in this election, at least to my knowledge from the numbers I've seen. But I do hear in my reporting about essentially lobbyists making exactly this threat, particularly on smaller things that the public isn't watching, amendments and the like. So do you worry about that kind of power being exercised?
So first of all, campaign spending has been rising pretty steadily for decades, regardless of any particular Supreme Court decisions or changes in the rules. The money is, as government grows and there's more things that people want to affect, they're going to spend money on it. But I'm not concerned about that. I'm not concerned about super PACs. I mean, they sound scary, but it's really people getting together to pool their money. Something like a George Soros or the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson spending a lot of money, they've always been able to do that. And unless politicians really want to say, incumbents, we want to protect our seats so much that we're going to stop independent individuals, either to look together or just independent billionaires, from spending their money on political speech, if that's what they want to do, I mean, that's scary to me in terms of protecting the First Amendment.
Lawrence Lessig, Harvard Law Professor, and Ilya Shapiro, Senior Fellow in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Thank you both so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.